Hi friends. Today I'm going to talk with you a bit about the 1871 military action between Korea and the United States. And in this part I want to show you both some of the things that have been found that are actual relics from the 1871 battle, along with some things that are reproductions or are American Civil War era artifacts. And before I do that, I want to be able to explain a little bit about what this is all about. When I first started doing serious field research into the 1871 action, that was probably back around 1999. And at that time I had it was a good metal detector, but it was actually not really suitable for land use. It was actually one that was designed for searching in the water. I mean, it worked on land, but it wasn't what it was really designed for. So it was kind of hit and miss with what I was able to find. But it worked, and I did find things. But at that time, Ganghwa Island, where the battle took place, was still relatively pristine. Back then, the battle areas were still relatively untouched. That is not the case today. Over the last 2 decades, there's been a lot of development on the island. And some areas that were very important historic battle sites from the Shinmyeongyo, which is the Korean name for the 1871 action. Many of the important battle sites today are dug up. They're gone. For development. There are things have been dug up. There's a hospital in one area. I mean, hey, it's nice. It's good to have hospitals and such, but the area is gone. That can no longer be searched. There are restaurants. There's one very important hill, which is where a lot of the it's where the American artillery was first placed. That hill is almost completely gone now. And even 2 decades ago, I could see that happening. And so it was important to me to try to gather as much information as I could while the areas were still relatively intact. And I'm glad I did, because a lot of these artifacts, these relics from 1871, they would have just been scooped up by backhoes and thrown away as trash. When you talk with people from the Korean Cultural Department, to them, 1871 is recent history in their view. To them, what I and some others have found, they're trash. Who cares in their minds? But of course, if I and others had not gathered these things, they'd be gone, and we wouldn't have the historical record of where they were found, what was found where, documented, because whenever we find anything, we take photographs, we look on a GPS, we find the reading where it was found, so we can, and then from that we can even go back to like Google Earth, and we have all of our things plugged in, and we can see the relative areas where everything was, and they tell a story. People wonder, so now that's your collection, right? No, it's not. you know what? I'm a caretaker of these. I'm a caretaker. Someday, when there is the proper exhibit in a Korean museum, I hope, truly hope, these can become part of that. As a matter of fact, even some of my things that I have bought that are American Civil War era, you know, I'll probably donate those along with everything that I have found. But it has to be in a proper exhibit. Until then, I will be the caretaker of them. That I've always felt that way, always. And let me tell you why these are important. They're important because, as I said, they tell a story. And some people might wonder, well, how can these inanimate objects that are just laying in the ground, how can they tell a story? Well, one thing is where you find them, and what it is you find and where you find them, more specifically. If, for instance, I find a bullet casing, which the American sailors were the only ones who had weapons, firearms that had metal cases at that time. So if I find a bullet casing, well, that means sailors were there. There were sailors in that spot, and they shot someplace. If I find a spent bullet, one that is damaged, you can tell that it had been fired, well, I would look at what is the caliber. So what gun did it come from? Whose side did it come from? And because it was fired in a certain direction, I found it in a certain area, chances are that's where the opponent was positioned. And so on. Everything tells a story, and I'll tell you a few stories as we go along here. All right, with that, let me show you some of what we have here, and then give you a little bit of an idea about some of the stories. And I'll start over in this far point over here, and I'm gonna go just kind of like section by section. And very honestly, these are not really in any specific order. These were mainly placed in here just to protect them as much as possible. But right up here in this corner here, and I'll try to show you here. And some things there is no real answer. And I'll try to show here. This is a button. It has crossed anchors. Okay, it has crossed anchors. And this was found by a former colleague of mine, Dan Morris. And he and I was there when he found it. He and I were searching in this one valley. And it was a valley that it had hills on three sides. So it was a closed-in valley. And we were actually finding many types of projectiles and such over there, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And one thing that any detectorist, metal detectorist, can tell you is that it's really a great day when you find a button, because buttons can usually be attributed to some specific unit, type of service, etc. And I was up on the side of a hill doing some detecting, and I found a couple of things, and then I heard Dan. He called to me and he says, Tom, he says, come here. He says, I found something, I just can't believe it. So went over there, and he was right on the flat, level ground area, and he found that button. And crossed anchors, well, we think that's a common representation, like for a bosun's mate in the Navy. And so we were both kind of thinking, well, let's look it up. We both did. We looked all over the place for this button. Couldn't find it anywhere. It was not standard issue for the American Navy at the time. As a matter of fact, we really couldn't find it for standard issue for anything at the time. Now the button is falling apart. I mean, it's the metal, it has problems. The back is gone on it. Its age is easily dating back to 1871, just from the looks of it. So the only thing we can really kind of figure is it was probably somebody had off-brand, shall we say, uniforms made for them. It's about the only thing we can really kind of figure on that. Now, someday somebody might find me a very specific answer on that button, but right now I don't have it. But anyway, somebody who was nautical was in that spot. That's about all we can tell. Now, you know, and this is one thing when you think about inference and things like that. You know, you can only, when you infer something, you can only go with what information you have, with any kind of inference. And that, the only inference we can say is, because of crossed anchors button, somebody who was nautical was in that area probably at that time. Or at least a uniform with that button was in that area at that time. Alright, so there's that. Now, the next ones that I'm going to show you, actually there are a lot more than what I'm picking up here. I'm just picking a few. Let's see here. Oops. And I'll pick this one too. But first, here are a few Korean musket balls from the Korean matchlock. Okay, so you get a little look at those. These are approximately 45 caliber. Most of them that I have are quite round and fairly undamaged, but some of them have little nicks and depressions showing that they hit things when they were fired. They're made out of lead, and lead will, of course, deform when it hits things. And now I have something here. This is one that's completely flat. So this is actually a Korean musket ball that hit something very hard. I don't remember exactly where this one was found, but it probably was found at a spot where Koreans were shooting more point blank, had a little bit of force behind it. But most of these were found some distance from the main fortress of Sondomokdonde. So I have many of these, but I just wanted to show you a few. Next down here, and this one, I'm going to keep this in its plastic, but I'll try to show you. This one was very amazing to find. Can you see that? What that is a percussion cap. It was the U.S. Marines were using mainly two types of firearms. They had generally the M1861 Springfield rifle, and also they also were using another rifle that was called the Whitneyville Plymouth. Both of them are muzzle loading rifles, meaning the powder charge and the bullet are put down from the muzzle of the gun down the barrel. So they're muzzle loading. Both of them are. Now the Springfield was a .577 caliber. We just quite often say 58 caliber. And the Whitneyville Plymouth was a 69 caliber. And both of them as I said, were muzzle loading. That's all the Marines had. They only had muzzle loaders. And after you put your powder down the barrel, then you put your bullet, which was goes by, it's called a Minie Ball, is the more common term, from the French fellow who invented, called Minier, but we just say Minie Ball, and I'll show you some examples here shortly. You ram that down the muzzle, and then you take a percussion cap, and when the hammer is pulled back halfway, which is half cocked, we call it, that way it won't fire. And this is put on the nipple or the cone, it's both names, of your rifle. Originally it had a very little fulminate explosive on the inside, so that when you pulled the trigger to your gun, well, of course you have to pull it back to full cock at that point, pull the trigger on your gun, the hammer goes down, it would hit the cap against the cone, the nipple, and it would explode that fulminate, which would go into the vent of the gun, ignite the main charge, which of course would propel the bullet, the Minie Ball, down the barrel. And this was a miracle to find. Really, truly it was. As far as I know, only 2 of them have been found. I found one, and then some years later, Dan found one. Others may have found them, but I've never heard of it happening. But then again, we knew what we were looking for. Other people would probably look at this and say, yeah, what's that? But anyway, and where this was found is important, and I'll explain that in a minute. I'll put this one actually right here for now. All right, now coming this way more. Now this is a reproduction. As a matter of, and it is a reproduction of what's known as a Boorman Fuse. A Boorman Fuse. And by the way, I'll come back to a lot of these things to kind of put them together so you can kind of see it. Right now I'm just kind of explaining what it is. It's a Boorman time fuse. It was made out of, like pewter. The material is kind of a lead pewter type thing. And you'll notice that there are numbers that run in a semicircle there. And those numbers, they represent time in seconds. And what would happen is, in order to get an explosive shell ready to fire, they would have kind of a nail, a pin, a special one, that they would poke a hole at the amount of time there. And then when the cannon fired the shell, the fire from the propelling charge would ignite powder that would, now here's the back of it, you can kind of see it has a horseshoe shape, that would have been filled with a powder. And so it would ignite the powder, and the powder burned in a very exact time amount. And so it would burn from that point down to the charge that was inside the explosive shell, and then explode the shell at that given point. So from 1 to 5 seconds. So anyway, but this is a reproduction, and I'll explain that later too. Now another type of, this is another type of fuse. That was the Boorman fuse that I just showed you. This one here, this fuse was meant for a Schinkel shell. Now the Schinkel, and I'll show you a Schinkel here shortly. The Schinkel shell was a rifled shell. Now, the Boorman Fuse was used on what we would call smoothbore artillery. Smoothbore meaning there's no rifling in the barrel, it's smooth. So when things get shot out, they just go out. I mean, they're not quite as accurate as rifled, because in a rifled tube, there is where it gets its name, rifling. It's this circular spinning that has been put onto the inside of the artillery piece, its barrel, and the artillery itself is oblong, kind of, and it would fit into the rifling and it would make the shell spin, and that would give the shell stability, and also the stability added to accuracy, and also rifled rounds tended to be, they had a longer range, longer firing range, and accurate firing range. Now this particular type, it was one that was, this particular one was meant as a percussion fuse, so it hits something and explodes. Whereas the Boorman that I showed you here, this was a time fuse. It exploded, it burst when the powder went through its trail and ended up with the main charge. Okay, all right. Next thing that I come across here is, as I said, these are in no particular order. I'm kind of quantum leaping around, if any of you remember that show. This here is a very special bullet, and I'll show this one to you here. I'll kind of turn it around here a little bit. You can kind of see it's very deformed on the tip, isn't it? Well, let me explain this one to you, and then come back to it even. This is a .50 caliber bullet. This was meant for the Remington rolling block Navy carbine. Okay, so this is a .50 caliber bullet. It was never fired. But you're going to wonder, well, gee, what's all of that deformation at the top? Let me tell you a story. And I'll put this one right here. One day, my friend Dan and I, we were out detecting on the battlefield hills. And I was in one area, and one thing about Dan is somebody who I always called the Relic Whisperer. He had this it was almost like a sense about where something is, where to look for something, and he's almost always right. Where he was out he would find really fantastic items, and I was finding bottle caps and nails and wire. And I was happy. I mean, because with Dan around, it was like, what are we going to find next? And boy, do I have some stories on that one. But in this case, Dan decided to detect the side of a hill, well, kind of a hill. It was right next to, well, not right next to, it was attached to the trail that led away from the main fortress, the Solnomokdonde fortress, where the final battle happened between the Americans and Koreans on June 11th, 1871. And this is the side of that trail. All right, the trail's up here, and this is kind of going down into a ditch. And so Dan is detecting the side of that hill. Very quickly, he gets a big iron signal. And he's, you know, clearing things away, because it was not a very deep signal at all. And he says, Tom, come take a look at this. So I went over to him, and I'll show you our next part, because it's important too. And yeah. See these? These are iron canister shot. Just a couple of them. I have many. But anyway, and I'll put that one right next to that. I'll put both of them there. I look at what he had cleared away, and there was iron canister shot, many of them, and they were in a almost perfect grouped circle. I mean, it kind of looked like a bunch of grapes, very dirty grapes in the ground. And I was like, wow. Now, why am I saying wow? Well, now Dan and I, we actually, in other areas, we found many iron shot, the canister shot. And I'll explain about canister in a bit. We found many of those in other places before, so why was this so special? Well, the purpose of canister is to, when a canister is fired from a cannon, the whole idea is the shot spreads out quickly, like a giant shotgun. Well, as a matter of fact, you know what? Even though I was kind of going like this, I'm going to cut ahead to something I have way over here. Let me explain the canister shot. This is called a sabot. S-A-B-O-T. Some people say sabot. And just a wood stand, shall we say. And then you'd have a metal plate. It's about 1/4 inch. And that would fit on top here. And then I don't have the sides of it with me, but I'll explain. There's like a tin can that came up here, and it was a certain height, and you would have canister shot filling that can. Now, not just the shot, and they also used shavings and, well, sawdust, things like that as filler, so that the shot isn't completely moving around. So it helped pack it in. And there were a certain number of these balls. Usually for the Navy, quite often they were up around 39, something like that. But they varied. It depended on what it was being used for. So there was canister that was, you know, so you can just kind of imagine having all of these metal balls in tiers, so these different levels filling up, and then there's the metal sides, the can that holds everything in, and then that would be topped off here. So it was like a giant shotgun shell. Okay, and then here, I'll take this off for now. In the back, see this little, have a little bag here, which you see how there's kind of the ridges there at that end? That's purposely done. You'd have this bag. Now the bag would be filled with black powder. Okay, so the bag would be filled with black powder, and then there would be a line that would go around here to tie it onto the sabot. And then, as I said, you'd have your plate there. You'd have your can coming up here, the can filled with all of your canister shot and then capped off. Then, when you're ready, this goes down the cannon tube goes way back to the breech. And then the vent, which is the hole from the outside down into the main chamber where this bag now sits. A gunner would take a pin, a very long pin, push it down there, that would poke this bag, and then they would have, then there's what they would call a Quill Primer, which was a primer that was, it was a tube, a kind of a tube that was filled with a fulminate, just like the percussion cap that I showed you here. And then, depending on the cannon used, there were different ways of firing it. But however, with what was known as the Dahlgren boat howitzer, which was the type of artillery that the Americans landed on Ganghwa Island, the Dahlgren boat howitzer had a special kind of a hammer that was developed by Admiral John Dahlgren, and it had a lanyard attached to it. It was like this when they were before firing. Then when you pulled the lanyard, it would slap over. It would hit that primer that goes down into the vent. Hit the primer. That would ignite. The primer would ignite. Go down into the vent. Oops. Didn't do that. Just a second here. All right. And then that would go down into the powder in the main charge here, and then it would ignite the main charge, which of course would propel what it is attached to down the tube and out. And that's the way it was for any kind of projectile that was put down there. And in this case, in the case of a canister round, which I described to you, with the can on it and such, it would go down the tube. As soon as it would exit the tube, very quickly, the can would break apart, and you would have the plate, which all of the canister shot are sitting on. The plate and the shot are still going forward. The side of the can doesn't matter. It just very quickly just goes off to the sides. But these are still going forward. But very quickly, they spread apart. Because, as I said, at that point, the cannon is essentially acting like a very giant shotgun. But the shot is very, very big and heavy. And it was used against enemy troops maybe 200 to 400 yards away. But it would spread out very quickly. It would spread out to the sides, it would spread up, it would spread down, kind of a cone. But it would spread out. So, coming back to my story about what Dan found, remember I said the side of this hill, he found this, well, and I'll just use these just for illustrative purposes. And here this thing's falling all over the place. For illustrative purposes, he found, a whole bunch of shot that were kind of together like that, just in the side of this hill. Remember what I said, that it's important to the story, the historical story, where things were found. What was found and where was it found? So can you imagine now, if these things are supposed to spread out quickly, but we found a grouping of them very close together in the side of a hill, what does that tell you? Well, it tells you that the cannon that shot it was very close. Probably what we might consider to be point blank. Now, point blank in cannon terms is very relative. And I asked many artillery experts about that. You know, how far away from the cannon tube might you see something like this? And almost all of them said it wouldn't be very far. At the very probably 25 to 50 yards, probably, if that. So I was really curious about this, and a couple of years ago I decided to check things out. So what I did was I got a very high-powered laser pointer, number one, and there's a whole story behind that I'm not going to bore you with. I had trouble getting it. But anyway, I had this high-powered laser pointer, and I also took a camera tripod and some other meter items and things like this. And I was trying to figure out where that cannon was placed. And so when I went back to Gangha Island a couple of years ago and I did this, the only place that cannon could have been was probably no more than about 10 yards away. 10, 20 yards. Just really a lot within that point blank range. And I say that because of the topography of where we were, the angle at where the shot was found, and so on. I kind of deduced where that artillery piece would have been placed. And when I went back to look at who was placed where and such, and this is actually in the book that I wrote, it worked out. So I could probably I could tell you who were the gunners. So this is why I say, when you find things like this, it's really important. Now, what does that have to do with this deformed bullet that I found? Well, that adds a second part to this story. And this is one we'll probably never know the true answer. But it made logical sense to me anyway. Well, while Dan was still kind of detecting in the area where he had found that grouping, and he was finding some other somewhat looser ones that were surrounding that main grouping. I was a couple meters, a couple yards away from him on that hill. I thought, well, let me see if I can find anything over here. And I was getting a different kind of a signal on my metal detector. He was getting one that is a very big iron signal. It has a very strong, deep tone to it. When you get the strong, deep tone on the metal detector, you know it's iron. But I was getting one that was high-pitched. High-pitched means it's another type of metal. And it's got a deep, 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 deep. Detectorists out there, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So anyway, I figured out right where it was. Went in there with I have a pointer detector also, and so I was able to find this fairly quickly. And it was not even really in the ground. This was just barely below the surface. Just barely below. And when I first looked at it, I was thinking, oh, that's strange. I knew it was a 50 caliber from a Remington rolling block Navy carbine. I knew that. But I couldn't figure out what was the deformation on this. Because for one thing, this thing was definitely not fired. And if it had been fired, this is not the kind of deformation you would see. Let me show you the kind of deformation you would see. Let me show you. Here's another 50 caliber. Well, and while we're at it, I'm going to skip right in here. And, all right, all kinds of goodies here. This is an unfired 50 caliber from, this is an original. This is an original. This came out of a cartridge, a 50 caliber 45 grain cartridge that was found on Gangha Island. This is unfired. Okay, let me put this one right here. Here's one that I found on the side of a hill, which told me that Koreans were there because this is an American round. Look at this. Look at the deformation. It's mushroomed. You can see that there. It's the same as this one, just this one is very definitely fired. And this would have been fired from quite a distance, actually. But it's still mushroomed when it hit the ground. So compare those two right there. You can kind of see that. Now, put this one here, right next to that. You can see very, very, very big difference there, right? Well, there was something about its shape that something in my mind, it was tickling my mind a little bit. And then suddenly, it dawned on me. And when I looked closer and such, these were teeth marks. These were teeth marks. And suddenly, in my mind, was the term bite bullet, sometimes also known as a pain bullet. And they're documented, even in the American Civil War, documented that people use them. When you're having some quick field surgery being done, people would bite down on something, and sometimes that might have been a soft lead bullet. Bite down on it. Now, some people poo-poo that idea. There are those who say that, oh, no, there's no such thing as a bite bullet. Nah, they didn't do that, blah, blah. I've heard that. Or they say, oh, yeah, those are bullets. They were dug up by pigs. And the pigs thought that they were, some tuber or something that they like to eat. Well, there may have been some of those. But however, number one, there are no pigs on Gangha Island, at least no willing ones. The only ones I've ever found were in restaurants. And these are human teeth marks. You can just tell by the size. And not only that, it fits the narrative of what just popped into my mind at that time. Here's what I think happened. This was towards the end of the battle on June 11th, 1871. When the fort, the Sondomokdonde fort, was taken over by the Americans, the remaining Korean forces, they tried to get away so they could regroup somewhere else. Now, many Korean forces, when they couldn't get away, some of them did kill themselves, but they weren't going to just kill themselves just to kill themselves. If they could get away and regroup to live to fight another day, they were going to do that. So many Korean forces ran off in different directions, and this was recorded by the American officers. It's written in their reports. And one of the routes of egress, shall we say, was that trail that I told you about, that where Dan found the canister shot and I found this bullet. The trail has been there historically, and it's pretty much it's the same spot that it was back in 1871. So here's what I think happened. There were Korean troops that were trying to run away on that trail, and unbeknownst to them, just off to the side was one of the 7 Howitzer artillery pieces that the Americans had. And when the Americans saw the Koreans running up that trail, they were going to try to cut them off. So they probably pivoted their piece very quickly. They probably didn't have enough time to take true aim with it. It would have been filled with canister shot. It was more point blank shooting, so they figured, well, we're going to shoot in that general direction. They fired. Most of the canister balls went into the side of the hill, and they became that grouping. But I believe at least one of them went above the hill onto the trail, and it probably caught one of the Korean soldiers, probably caught one of them in the leg, which that would have brought him down immediately. A 1-inch iron canister ball being fired from a cannon is devastating. You can find pictures of what it's done to people. And if this hit you in any part of your body, it's going to do great damage. If it hits you in a limb, like your leg, it's probably going to completely shatter, or maybe even separate you from your leg, from where it hits. If it hits you in your body mass, you're dead. I mean, pure and simple. You're not going to come away from it, or in the head. You're not coming away from that. But if you get hit in an arm or a leg, it's going to completely ruin that arm or leg. But it's survivable. And so what I think happened is, at least one of those, well, not one of these, but one of the canister shot from that cannon blast, that howitzer blast, at least one of them hit this Korean defender in the leg, and he would have gone down immediately. Now, the Americans really wanted to have prisoners. Because in their minds, they were going to use them as bargaining chips. Now, this is for another story, another day, but the Korean government wasn't going to bargain for them at all. As a matter of fact, they were very disdainful for anybody who was taken prisoner alive. Their attitude when the Americans, later on when the Americans were telling them, we have 20 of your guys as prisoner, the Koreans basically said to keep them. They didn't want them. To them, they were in the Koreans' mindset, they were dead already. They were officially dead. But the Americans didn't know that at the time. So in the Americans' mind, because they were thinking on how they would react if there were their prisoners and such, and they would think, oh, if we can get some of our guys back, oh, that's a nice goodwill gesture and everything. That's what the Americans had in mind. So anyway, back to our story. What I believe happened is, very quickly, that gun crew went to that downed Korean, and they performed a very quick field surgery process of amputation. What they probably did was one of the sailors took out one of his cartridges, removed it, removed the bullet from the brass, put it into the Korean's mouth and forced him to bite down on it while somebody else probably very quickly removed whatever was left of his limb, and probably put a tourniquet and all of that to try to save his life, so that they could have him as a prisoner to exchange. And I personally think that's a very plausible story. I really think that probably happened. Now, of course, as I said, we'll never know. Not unless somebody goes back to that area and finds a severed limb. then maybe we can talk about it. But this just it's where you piece things together and you see what's the possible historical narrative, and that's what that one was. Okay, all right. So anyway, there's that. Let me continue on, because there's a lot more here. Now, this is an interesting one. All right, this is my reproduction plate. This is a fragment of a real plate. Not much left. And this was in the side of the valley where I told you Dan found that button. This was at the very back of that valley on the side of the hill, and right around where some of the canister shop were found. Okay, so there's that. Anyway. Now these you're not really going to recognize at all, but lead. And these are actually 38 caliber spent rounds. Both of them are. 2 38 caliber spent rounds. And why that's important is the issued arm for naval officers was a 36 caliber model 1851 Navy Colt. That was their issued arm. And that's what we call cap and ball, which means that revolver was essentially a muzzleloader, because you had to load in powder and also the bullet, which they refer to as a ball, even if it was a conical bullet shape. Sometimes they use ball, but conical also. So it was essentially a muzzleloader, because you had to load each one like a muzzleloader, each chamber in the cylinder. 36 caliber. But by that time, there were what were called conversion cylinders. And what they would do, they would turn a 36 caliber cap and ball revolver into a 38 caliber metal cartridge. And that was very, very useful, because you didn't have to load individual powder charges and bullets. Even if you had spare cylinders with you, that's a lot to carry. So it was a lot easier to have the metal cartridge type system, that you could just load those into a cylinder, replace the cylinder into the revolver, and it was much quicker that way, for one thing. So anyway, that's why I say that's why I was finding 38 caliber, was because of that. Another thing here. This one you're not gonna see very much, but I'll show you anyway. It's little round lead disc, which I keep in this coin collector thing, and that little lead disc, when you do look at it, you'll see some writing. What it says 5 and the number 5, and underneath the letters SEC, which means 5 seconds. And what that is a tab that goes on top of what's known as a water cap fuse, which were naval artillery fuses, meant to, because you're out in the water and such, and you want to keep these things very hermetically sealed and dry and like that. And that tab is something that would be removed just before firing a round. And specifically, that would have been, this one was for a rifled round. So of the 7 howitzers that were brought onto Ganghwa Island, 1 of them was rifled. So this would have been used by that particular howitzer. And 5 SEC, 5 seconds, means that that fuse was a 5-second fuse. So you fire it, and it was a time fuse meant to explode 5 seconds later, which with a rifled round would have been quite a long distance. So they were firing at something that was a very long distance away, and it probably would have been troops that were up in the hills, some distance from where I found this. And this was found. Remember, I told you about that first artillery hill that now has been completely decimated by development. There's nothing on it anymore. Well, that's something that I found there. If I had not found that, we wouldn't have known. But now we can place a particular artillery piece on that hill. We know who was manning that artillery piece, so we can place individual people on that hill. So yes, it's one little item, but important. This is not much. This is something I found over 20 years ago. It's what Koreans call a yupjeon. And it's just a coin. This coin dates from the early 19th century. It's a Chinese coin which was used as legal tender in Korea for a long time. But anyway, it's just something I happened to find about 20 years ago. This is a fragment from a 12-pounder explosive shell. Now, since we're talking about shells and such, let me show you examples of the shells. I said 12-pounder, and I'm going to put that one there. This is a 12-pounder. Well, half of one, actually. It's cut in half. See that? You can see the cavity inside. As a matter of fact, up here, and I'll put this end on, there's the Boorman Fuse. Same as like this reproduction here. So this would have fit like that. And then you have the walls of the shell. This would have been filled with powder, a powder charge, so that when the timer fuse burned down to that, it would burst. It would burst the shell, which then becomes fragments like these. These are both 12-pounder fragments. Both of these are. So now this was from the American Civil War. Well, actually, even the things that the Americans used in 1871 were from the Civil War. They were surplus. But these are ones that I actually bought these in the United States so that I could show people what entire things looked like. And you can even see up here, you can see the trail, the powder trail that comes down into the main charge here. Now, as I said, this is called explosive shell. There's another type of shell that had a little bit, the wall was a little bit thinner, and it was filled with lead balls. And that one was called cased shot, also known as shrapnel, as a shrapnel round. And of course, shrapnel comes from the British officer a couple hundred years ago who invented this particular type of a round. And so when you hear nowadays when people say, "Oh, that soldier got hit with shrapnel." Nowadays shrapnel generally means any kind of metal or that comes from some artillery round that explodes and goes into somebody's body. Oh, he's hit with shrapnel. But back then, shrapnel was specifically talking about the metal balls inside. But even if you got hit with one of the fragments of the shell itself, nowadays you'd call that also shrapnel. But of course, these are heavy iron. Even the smaller one here, you got hit with this, you're in big trouble. I mean, if you get hit, just like with the shot, you get hit in the limb, it's going to remove your limb. If you get hit in the chest or the head, you're dead. Period. Now, I'll show you another fragment. My son found this one many years ago. And this particular one's interesting because this is right where the fuse went. You can see the threading on the inside. So this was the top of the round. It's really kind of interesting because all the searching I've been doing on Gangha Island over the last 20 years, I have never found an exploded Boorman Fuse. I have never found one. I've looked. I really wanted it. Matter of fact, I have an original from the Civil War that was exploded. I couldn't find it today to show to you, but I have it somewhere. But for some reason, I could never find these. But we did find where, I can just kind of show you like this. So this is where it went into. It's there somewhere on the island, probably. So there's that. Now, this is a Schinkel shell, and I'm going to be really careful turning this over because this one's a little bit different. But I'm just going to kind of show you here. See this? Very oblong. The Schinkel is a rifled round. This one went in. This is the type like would have gone into the rifled boat howitzer. And this is the one, this is what this type of fuse was used for. Now, this one probably used a slightly different size of fuse, but similar. But it was basically like this. Now, this particular round is a little different because if you look in here, it isn't empty. This one here you see is empty. This is what we call the explosive shell. This one here is filled up. As a matter of fact, these are all metal balls. This is a shrapnel round, or as I said, this is a case shot round. And they were suspended in a matrix. It's a sulfur something matrix that they would make that would hold them in place in here. And then there would have been originally a powder charge, what was called a bursting charge, that would be put right here. So that when when it would hit, depending on what type of fuse you're using, if you had a percussion fuse, it would hit something and explode. Or if you had a timer fuse, just similar to like what the Boorman is there, it would reach its time and explode. And then it would burst. And what would happen is, not only would you have the walls of the shell bursting, but you would also have all of these metal balls bursting. So it was meant as an anti-personnel round. Well, these all are actually anti-personnel rounds. And this is a fragment. Okay, so here's a fragment of an original from 1871, just to show you. So you can see what they kind of looked like then, and then what happens when they explode. Very quickly, let me just kind of give you a little idea about how they had to determine what to use with their artillery. Now, the Americans were using these against Korean troops. These smaller rounds were not really meant for bringing down fortress walls or anything. These were specifically meant to kill human beings. And the way that is done in the case of explosive shells is timing is really important. You know how fast the projectile goes, so you know that what distance it'll cover in what amount of time. You know where the enemy troops are, so you have to figure out what distance they're at. And then what you want the shell will explode in the air, and it needs to explode just forward of the enemy troops, so that when it explodes, all of the pieces are still going forward. Even after it explodes, they're still going forward, and they're spreading out again into this cone shape. And if it explodes too soon, it'll miss all the troops. They're too far back. So if your fuse is too short, shall we say, the timing is too short, it won't hit them. It'll explode too soon. Or if your timer is too long, it'll go over the troops, explode, and it won't hit them. The pieces will still be going forward, and the troops are over here. So that's why the artillerists they would need to know specific information and exactly where in the air this is going to burst, so that it has the most effect on the enemy. And that's how these were used. Now the canister, as we said, and I told you about the canister, it was one that was just shot at the enemy. And as I said, it had about a 200 to 400 yard or meter, it's either way, effective range. So it was a very big deterrent for the Koreans. They were not used to this kind of weaponry being used. And it's really the only reason that the Americans remained pretty much untouched all the way until the final battle at Solomontonde, because they kept the Koreans at a distance. Remember, the Koreans were using these 45 caliber antiquated matchlock muskets, smoothbore muskets. They weren't rifled, they were smoothbore, which probably 50 to 75 yards, 100 yards max, that these things would be effective at all. And that's why, many of these musket balls that I found from the Korean matchlocks, that's why many of them were undamaged when I found them, because they just reached a limit and dropped. Many of those I found right near the surface. The only reason they had any dirt at all over them is just literally the sands of time. Because probably for the longest time they were just sitting on the open ground where they landed. The Americans even talked about just how irritating the Korean musket balls were. They were just landing amongst them. They'd rattle in the trees maybe a little or something, but by the time they reached the Americans, who were maybe at about 120 yards away before attacking the main fortress, the energy was spent. So they were out of range. Whereas the Americans' arms had a much longer range, including their artillery. Now, let me go into a little bit more about the Americans' personal arms. I told you a little bit. I mean, we talked a little bit about it here, but not really a lot. First, just before I get to that, I want to show you this one. This shot is lead. And this is an iron shot. And I and my son found a couple of these on a hill. And most canisters mostly used iron shot, but the Navy did use some lead shot. And so we found, that's what we found some of on a hill where, and again, it told us a story that Korean troops had to have been there because that's what the Americans were shooting at. And we knew where they were shooting from that one artillery hill I told you about. That's all almost gone now. And the distance from that hill to where we found those, just about 400 yards. 300 to 400 yards maybe. So it was within that range. Anyway. Now, as I said, the U.S. Marines used the muzzle-loading rifles from the American Civil War. They had either the M1861. They might have had some may have had a slightly newer version, but it still would have been Civil War era. Or they were using the Whitneyville Plymouth 69 caliber. Now, just to give you an idea, let me show you. This is the .577, or let's say 58 caliber Minie Ball bullet for the Springfield rifle. Now, you'll look in the back there, you'll see it's hollow, right? And let me explain why this one was important. This changed warfare in the 19th century. Because with rifled personal arms, rifled long arms that troops used, they were able to get very high accuracy, and also range was increased. So it was important. How did that happen? Well, remember, the inside of the barrels are rifled, which is why we call them rifles, which is that it's a spiral that is carved into the inside of the barrel. This is lead, and that for the Minie Ball, the hollow portion there, which you would probably call that a skirt, is important because you put your powder down the barrel, the Minie Ball, the bullet is put down the barrel, ram it down, you put your cap on the nipple, the cone, and when you pull the trigger again, the hammer falls down on the cap, it explodes the fulminate charge, goes down vent into the main charge of powder that you have, which ignites, and the gases it produces not only is pushing this bullet out, but another thing it's doing, this lead skirt kind of goes like this. The lead bites into the rifling inside the barrel, which starts the bullet spinning. And the spinning is what gives it its stabilization, which of course gives you your accuracy and your distance. So that's why this was a very, very revolutionary change in firearms when this type of bullet was developed. But this is the 58 caliber, the .577 for the Springfield. And then this is a 69 caliber. Same thing, a little dinged up there on the side, but that's just that dinging. It was probably me, to be honest, when I found the signal. So I probably hit that actually with my digging tool. This would have just been these were actually both just dropped rounds. These were never fired. Neither of these were. But compare the size, you can see 58 caliber, 69 caliber. So the Whitneyville Plymouth had a very, very heavy round that it used. Put these here so you can kind of see the difference there. But anyway, the Marines had those two rifles. And by the way, the Whitneyville Plymouth was totally a Navy arm. Whereas, a naval arm, I should say. Whereas the Springfield rifle was used by all branches of the service. And so that was the Marines. And I have a story that I'll tell you about that in a bit, but I want to show you something else while we're still going there. This is an intact 50 caliber 45 grain cartridge found on Ganghwa Island. There's still powder inside this. Still, the black powder's in it. The only thing is that the head that would have normally been there is gone. They fall off, especially from age. As a matter of fact, here's one right here. See? And I don't know if it went to that one or not. But anyway, it might have. Might have actually gone to this one. But anyway, this is the entire cartridge. The bullet, the brass. Now I want to show you something because this is important. Here's another one that's intact. Again, this one has the powder inside. But this one figures very importantly in the record, the U.S. records. Now let me show you the head on the back here. The stamp head here. You'll notice there's a pinstripe. See that? That means somebody tried to fire this, but it didn't fire. It was a misfire. And the thing was, there were many of these. At one time, they were littering the battlefield. I was very fortunate to come up with a couple of them. But they figure very prominently in the officer's report of Captain McLean Tilton. He was the captain of Marines. He was the head of the Marine contingent. And very importantly figures into that because he wrote about it. Because many sailors were complaining about misfires. In the end, they did a big investigation on this. what they found was the misfires were coming from rounds that were packed in paper boxes rather than wood boxes. So in other words, water was getting into the paper boxes, and it was rendering these bullets inert. So that's kind of an interesting point there. This is also a 50 caliber, but this is a 50 caliber 25 grain, and this went to the Remington rolling block 50 caliber pistol. This is a round that was used mostly by auxiliary troops, so sappers, miners, hospital corps. They were single shot pistols that fired 50 caliber, and these were rimfire, meaning that the hammer, the pin, when the hammer came down, the pin would strike the rim of the round to ignite the charge inside. Whereas, now, let me show you, get back to here. Whereas with the carbine, it was a center fire. The pin hit the center of the back of the cartridge to ignite the primer and fire the bullet. But anyway, this is an empty case. As a matter of fact, take a look, and I'll put it up towards the bottom. Look at the bottom there. See that little indentation? That is where the pin struck it. This is fired. Okay. The other one I showed you here, this is unfired. This was just a drop bullet. There's no pin strike at all. So this one was just dropped. Probably somebody was fumbling into his cartridge box to pull out a round, and that probably came up with his hand and just fell onto the ground. And I have others here. This is one that's fired. You can see the pin strike there too, but this one fired. Now, this is kind of interesting in a way. This is an intact cartridge that fell apart. This one fell apart. You can still see the black powder. Not so much there. Most of that has fallen out. Even though, I'll show you something, actually. Most of the black powder fell onto this cotton backing here. So when this thing fell apart, it just kind of fell. And you know what? Powder's still good. I've in the past, with another one that had broken, I took a little bit of it and took a lighter, and it, so still good stuff. Let's see. Now, oh yeah, I was going to tell you this. I was going to quickly tell you a story regarding these 58 calibers, and this involves Dan again. Dan, we had some great stories with Dan, because as I said, as he's the relic whisperer, some of his discoveries were just fantastic. And there was this one day, he and we went to Ganhwa Island together to go on another field research trip. And he says, Tom, I want to show you something, but I want to set it up for you first. So he wasn't going to tell me anything. All right, fine. He says, just follow me. So I did. So we walked that trail. Matter of fact, the trail that the Koreans probably were running on, that somebody probably got his leg blown off with an iron shot. But hey, we're walking on the trail towards the fortress, and he says, I want to show you something. So we probably we were just outside the reconstructed fortress, Sonomotonde Fortress, and we were just down the hill from it a bit into a little wooded area, maybe about 40 meters. And I noticed there were chopsticks, colored chopsticks. He had painted them. Some chopsticks were red, some chopsticks were blue. Okay, and they were all over the place. And he says, okay. Now, he was trying to get my attention on this. Remember what I said? Everything tells a story. So anyway, he says, what does this look like to you? I said, colored chopsticks? Well, he went and he cleared away one of them. And he says, come take a look. And I went over there to look next to this blue chopstick. There was about a half a dozen of these .58 caliber bullets, Minie Balls, in a pile. Okay. He says, now take a look right next to that next blue chopstick. I went over there. There was another handful of these. And another chopstick, a handful of these. They were spaced apart very uniformly. And he says, so, what does that tell you? I mean, immediately it told me a big story. Because they were all what we would call dropped rounds. And as a matter of fact, this is a story that kind of changed the narrative for me completely. Completely. What it told me was, this was the area that the Marines were just before the attack. Only about 40 meters away from the fortress. What these dropped rounds told me was these were the individual places where the Marines were. What they had done was they were probably kneeling or in the prone position, trying to stay out of sight of the Korean musketeers up in the fortress. And they would have taken cartridges out of their cartridge box and set them on the ground next to them so that they were easy to grab. They don't have to fumble in their cartridge box for them. They're right there. But then probably when the order came to attack, well, there's no time to gather up all the rounds and put them back or anything. They just got up and ran and left their rounds there. So that's why there's a little pile there, a little pile here, a little pile here. Now, what about the red chopsticks? Well, those are where Dan was finding Korean musket balls. So the Koreans knew the Marines were there. And the musket balls were what were being fired at them. And another thing that's important about this story is that would have been the position where the first American was killed by a Korean. He was an Irishman by the name of Dennis Hanrahan. He was just in his early 20s. He was from Kilkenny, Ireland, traveled the United States. He joined the United States Marine Corps, I think, in 1869. And so he was, a contingent of Marines that was along with, on board ship with the Americans. And so this young gentleman from Ireland was the first American casualty of the 1871 military action. He was killed right at the point that the Americans were just about to attack. He stood up to attack, and he was hit by a Korean musket ball and died. But as I said, this changed the narrative, because before Dan found those dropped bullets, I was always under the impression that the Marines were further back. I was under the impression that they were closer to the sailors, who made a line from one side to another within a line at the brow of a hill. But no, the Marines were right there. I mean, they were in a literal stone's throw from the fortress. And they were there first. So to me it was a very, very big change in the story. The narrative changed, all because Dan's discovery. So to me it was a very important discovery. There were other things that Dan found that were very fascinating. I mean, he and I, one morning, I mean, one time we got up to metal detect very early one morning. Matter of fact, we just got to Ganghwa Island, and it was really early. It was probably 6 a.m. maybe, and it was a foggy day, actually a little drizzly, rainy day. And my metal detector does not do well in wet weather, but his does. The one that he had back then. And we were going to be going and searching our regular areas and such, but we're driving by one place, which is it's a small island. At least it was an island. Now it's actually attached to Ganghwa Island, and so, but they still call it. And the small island just at the southern tip of Ganghwa Island, not the tip, the southeastern point. It was where the first shots the Americans took on June 10th, the day before the main battle. And it was when the gunboats were going up the Yamha, the Salt River, the straits between Ganghwa Island and the mainland. The Americans fired on where they saw some fortifications, and one of the fortifications was on this one island, which the Americans call Louise Island. And anyway, I was telling Dan about this, and he said, yeah, let's go check. So we drove up there, got out our detectors, and as I said, it was the soil was kind of wet, and there was wet grass and everything, and my detector was just going crazy. But Dan, no problem, and his spidey sense jumped in, and he started detecting this one point, and again got a very big iron signal. And now one thing I have to mention is that where we were detecting is right next to actually an active Korean Marine outpost. Nobody was in it at the time, but it's still used militarily. Anyway, he got this big iron signal, and he starts digging. And it was actually right where there had been old fortress walls in 1871. They would have been there. And he dug maybe about this much in, and he started pulling out fragments like this. In the end, he found an entire Schinkel Shell. Remember, I said this is a Schinkel Shell. Now, the one he found was larger than this. And in the end, he found not only the shell, but even the fragments from the fuse. I would say he had probably 98% of the shell when he was done. Later on, he took all those pieces, he put it back together. He pieced it all together, and it made the entire shell. So he has what is probably literally the first shot of the June 10th to 12th battle. Now, really, June 10th and 11th. The 12th there's really no fighting on that day. But even though they included in the thing, I think that was so they could call it a weekend war. But anyway, he found which was, as I said, literally the first shot of the Shinmyangyo. So I always thought that was a very, very interesting one that he found. So anyway, I hope that what I showed you here and some of the stories that I told you were helpful. Oh, I should mention one thing, because I should mention a little bit more. I told you the Marines had the M1861 Springfield rifles and also the Whitneyville Plymouth rifles. Sailors, they had the 50 caliber 45 grains of black powder metal cartridge Remington rolling blocks. And this is important because you can fire one of these. You can fire a Remington rolling block many, many times a minute. I mean, it's all how fast you go. Whereas firing a muzzle loader, probably 2 or 3 rounds a minute if you're fast enough. Maybe some guys could do faster than that. I can't. Firing one of these, Remington rolling block, I was personally able to do about 9 rounds a minute. I believe the record is something like 21 rounds a minute. And so more than twice what I did. So somebody is going really fast. They had a system, I'm sure. And I mean, I'm not an expert in shooting. I know how to shoot. I know what's involved with it, but it isn't something I do for a living. But somebody did it a lot faster than me. So, I mean, that's like once every 3 seconds they were firing. But the sailors had these. They had these metallic cartridge carbines. The Marines were not happy. As a matter of fact, Captain McLean Tilton of the Marines, he was very sore about the whole thing. He complained to the Navy. Later on, he complained that that the Marines should have also the rolling blocks. The Navy turned him down, which is very ironic when you consider he was on the board that approved the Remington rolling block carbines for Navy use. He was on the board that made the approval. His signature was part of the approval, but he was denied for his Marines. And why was he denied? Well, the government, for one thing, they don't. Then, like now, they sometimes really don't know what they're talking about. But they just told him, they says, well, your fighting with the Koreans is done. We don't expect any more, so you don't need it. They just said that. They said, you don't need better arms. We don't expect any more fighting for a while. But you know what? The Marines with their Springfield rifles did really well. I mean, they were good, hard-trained troops, and they shot very well. And one other thing, let me mention about Korean troops. Now, all of this was mostly, with the exception of the musket balls, I was mostly talking about American troops and their weaponry. And by the way, this is not the only artillery the Americans had. There was also the large artillery that the Americans had on board the 2 ships that were covering them. Now, actually, it ended up being 1 ship, the Monocacy, because the Palos was put out of action earlier. But anyway, Uh, yeah, the ships had larger artillery, including even 9-inch shell guns. I mean, which their shells were very heavy. Their fragments, each fragment was about the size of one of these. And they were actually meant for knocking down walls. And they did. The fortress walls of like Somonoton, they were taken way down to the ground. And you can even see that in some of the pictures of the time that Felice Beato took. Anyway, about the Koreans. There were there were officially about 600 Korean troops. There were actually more than that. Officially about 600. General Jae-yun, when he came in to take command of Ganghwa Island, military command, he actually brought a lot of his own irregular troops, which probably doubled his number. But officially there were 600 Korean troops. The Americans had landed 600 troops. There were about 500 sailors and 100 Marines. So, officially anyway, troop size, the Americans and Koreans were equal. There was a like number of American troops on board the ships that did not land. So it was just half of their forces landed. But anyway, Koreans and American, troop size-wise, equal. The American troops and the Korean troops were equally brave. The Korean troops were fierce fighters. Believe it or not, many people get in their minds that that Asians of that time were really short in stature and such. But you know what? Really, they weren't as much as you think. Back in the 19th century, Western people were a lot shorter than they are today. The average size of the sailor was like 5'7", 5'8". That was the average size of a sailor in 1871 in the U.S. Asiatic Squadron. The Korean troops were only maybe a couple of inches shorter than that. So really, size-wise, both in number and in stature, really about the same. Bravery, about the same. Fighting experience, probably about the same. Training, probably about the same. As a matter of fact, General Jae-yun's irregular troops were very experienced fighters. They took part in a lot of border clashes and such, protecting the peninsula, the Korean peninsula. So, U.S. and Korean troops were equal in all but one thing, and that was weaponry, especially artillery, but small arms too. The Koreans had small cannon, small swivel guns, basically. They were called bulangipo, small bronze cannons, but as far as we can tell, they weren't used in the battle. Koreans had bows and arrows, but as far as we can tell, they weren't used in the battle. There's no mention of them at all. There's no record that they were used, even though the bow and arrow was an official military weapon in Korea until 1894. But the Americans had superior artillery, very devastating artillery. Koreans were using 300-year-old matchlocks, or the technology was at least 300 years old, even if the matchlocks themselves may not have been. Probably did not use their small cannon, except for the very opening shots that they took on June 1st, which precipitated all of this. Well, actually, the Americans going up the Salt River, the Yamha, actually precipitated everything, but the Koreans firing on the Americans changed the dynamic. So that was probably the only time that that the Americans and Koreans I don't want to say only time. That's where the Americans and Koreans, they were equal to each other, but unequal in one very important way, and that was with weapons. If they were equally armed, the outcome might have been completely different. But again, that's a what if, and we'll probably never know. So anyway, thank you very much for joining me, and if you have any questions at all, please feel free to contact me. And I really want to encourage you to take a look at my book. It's an ebook right now on the 1871 military action. It's available on many platforms like Amazon and some others. Look on your favorite platform and you might find it there, but definitely on Amazon. And I give a lot more information about everything that happened. I'm not in this for the money. Believe me, I'll never get rich off of this. I never intended to, and I never will. As a matter of fact, I have probably invested more money into my research than I could ever possibly see in return. No, I do this because I love to educate, and I want people to know about all of this. And by the way, also, many people ask me if they can get a print edition of my book, and right now, unfortunately, not. My publisher said, "Well, we'll see how the ebook goes, and if that goes well, we might consider a print version." So, if you want to see a print version, please contribute towards the e-version right now, and then may the print version come out, and then I'll tell you what, if you get the e-version and then later on buy a print version, somehow I'll sign that book for you somehow. Anyway, that's what I have to say, and so thank you very much for watching this very long explanation on these items and some of the stories behind them, and please contact me if you have any other questions. Thank you very much.